Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we are embarking on this really incredible evidence-based exploration into what is arguably one of the most breathtakingly complex ecosystems in human biology, the female reproductive system. We're talking about a microscopic landscape of cellular communication, chemical handoffs, and physiological transformations that literally requires the entire body to perfectly coordinate. We're going to take a really close look at a process that affects half the population of the planet, yet somehow is still so frequently misunderstood. Yep, we're talking about the menstrual cycle, and specifically, the deeply fascinating science of why it varies so much from person to person.
So let's just dive right into the central scientific mystery here. Why on earth does one woman have a 25-day cycle while someone else has a 32-day cycle? And even wilder, why can the exact same woman experience a completely different cycle length from one month to the next? It's like a biological puzzle, right? Well, we are going to solve that puzzle today. By looking at both the clinical data and the microscopic biology, we're going to completely shatter the expectation that there's some rigid universal timeline we all follow.
All right, Chapter 1, The Myth of 28 Days.
We absolutely have to tackle this number right out of the gate. We've all heard it, right? That high school health class generalization about the textbook cycle? For decades, one specific number has just been drilled into our heads, 28 days. You see it hard-coded into period-tracking apps, it's printed in medical textbooks, and it's used as everyday clinical shorthand. It is literally everywhere. But here's the truth. While 28 days is a widely cited statistical median, treating it as a biological rule or some strict mandate for every woman is an absolute myth. It became super pervasive because, well, humans love averages, but our biology simply doesn't run on a synchronized 28-day factory clock.
When we actually look at the hard scientific data, this really fascinating picture emerges. According to the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, a normal menstrual cycle actually ranges anywhere from 21 to 35 days, with the actual bleeding lasting up to 7 days. But get this, it gets even more interesting. A major pooled analysis from PubMed, which basically means they aggregated massive, rigorously tracked data sets from hundreds of healthy women, found that 43% of those women naturally experienced a cycle length shift of more than 7 days from month to month. Let the scientific weight of that sink in for a second. Nearly half of completely healthy women have week-long variations in their own cycle. So how exactly does this happen?
Moving on to Chapter 2, the Hormone Symphony.
To really get why this variation happens, we have to look at the communication happening between the brain and the body. The hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the ovaries are constantly in this dynamic dialogue. And this dialogue relies on what scientists call the two-cell, two-gonadotropin hypothesis. Think of it like a beautiful, microscopic assembly line humming with absolute precision. First, luteinizing hormone, or LH, is released from the pituitary gland. It travels down to the ovary and signals the theca cells to start producing androgens. Next up, follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, activates the adjacent granulosa cells. Finally, in a perfect chemical handoff, those granulosa cells take the androgens and convert them into estrogen. This precise coordination is what drives the entire menstrual cycle forward. It's this intricate, breathtaking symphony of biology. And just like a real symphony, the tempo isn't locked to a machine's metronome. It naturally speeds up or slows down.
So while all that estrogen is brewing, it's actually driving a tangible physical process deep within the ovary. Early in the cycle, right around days 1 to 4, a whole cohort of follicles, these tiny fluid-filled sacs that each contain a single immature egg, is recruited to begin growing. Then, around days 5 to 7, this truly fierce competition kicks off. These follicles essentially race to become the most responsive to the body's signals. Ultimately, just one follicle is selected as the dominant one. From day 8 onward, this single dominant follicle grows rapidly, and it actively suppresses all the other follicles in the cohort, stopping them in their tracks. And the secret to our whole mystery today is right here. The timing of this microscopic recruitment, the fierce competition, and the final dominance. It doesn't have a strict schedule. It can naturally take more or less time to complete. And because this local competition dictates the timeline for the entire month, its natural variations directly impact the overall length of the cycle.
Which brings us to Chapter 3, A Tale of Two Phases.
If we really want to pin down where the delay happens in a woman's cycle, we got to split the cycle right down the middle. The menstrual cycle is basically divided by ovulation into two distinct halves. The first half is the follicular phase. This is when that dominant follicle we just talked about is maturing. And this phase is the wild card. It is highly variable from woman to woman and even month to month. It might take 10 days, or it could take 16 days or more. The second half, after ovulation, is the luteal phase. Driven by progesterone, its whole job is to prepare the uterus for potential implantation. And unlike the super unpredictable first half, the luteal phase is a rock-solid, unyielding biological constant. It almost always lasts exactly 14 days.
I want to emphasize this because it's absolutely crucial to everything we're discussing today. As clinical endocrine texts explicitly note, the variability of cycle length is usually derived from varying lengths of the follicular phase. In plain English, the delay is always in the biological prep work, never in the aftermath. If you have a 25-day cycle one month and a 32-day cycle the next, it's almost entirely because your follicular phase, the time it took your microscopic ecosystem to select and mature that dominant follicle, just took a bit longer. The entire back half of the cycle stayed exactly the same.
Next up, Chapter 4, How Age Changes the Cycle.
You know, our bodies aren't static machines. They're living ecosystems that evolve over our entire lifetime. Because of that, the extremes of reproductive life naturally feature the most irregular cycles. Think about menarche, when a young woman first begins menstruating, usually between 9 and 14. Her brain, pituitary gland, and ovaries are basically booting up their connection for the very first time. They're still calibrating, which naturally leads to wide variations as the system finds its groove. On the other end, during perimenopause, around age 50, the ecosystem is starting to wind down. Ovulation might not even happen every single month. That's a state called anovulation, which causes skipped periods or massive shifts in cycle length. But even in the middle, supposedly stable years, biological changes are still happening. That massive PubMed study we looked at earlier actually documented a really fascinating shift. Healthy women over 30 who haven't had children naturally see a slight shortening of both their overall cycle and their follicular phases. Variation is literally woven into the fabric of the aging process itself.
All right, Chapter 5, When to Seek Medical Care. So, with all this talk about how variation is totally normal, you might be wondering, okay, when is it actually a problem? It's really essential to define the boundary between normal biological variance and a condition that actually needs an OB-GYN's eyes on it. In the medical world, having an umbrella classification helps clinicians categorize variations that fall outside those healthy ranges we've discussed. This classification is known as abnormal uterine bleeding, or AUB for short. It's a broad clinical term for bleeding that is significantly different from typical patterns in duration, regularity, or frequency.
So, what are the actual red flags? According to the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, there are some very distinct boundaries. If your cycle is consistently shorter than 21 days or longer than 35 days, that's a red flag. If you experience bleeding between periods or after sex, that's another. If you're experiencing acute bleeding, and by that I mean soaking through a pad or tampon every single hour, that is a critical medical event, especially if you're feeling dizzy. That requires immediate emergency care. Also, if your cycle length suddenly starts varying by more than 7 to 9 days on a regular basis when it used to be super predictable, you should get that checked out. And this is a big one. Any bleeding at all after menopause means you absolutely need to see a doctor. No exceptions.
If you do happen to hit any of those red flags, what's a doctor actually looking for? Well, extreme irregularity usually points to a disruption in the biological processes we just broke down. It can be caused by ovulation problems like PCOS, where the hormone symphony gets disrupted, preventing that vital follicle competition we learned about. It could also be a thyroid issue like hypothyroidism. Then there are structural causes. Things like non-cancerous growths, uterine fibroids or polyps, can physically alter the uterus. Conditions like endometriosis or adenomyosis, where tissue similar to the uterine lining grows outside of it or deep into the muscle, can cause severe bleeding and pain. It could even be an undiagnosed bleeding disorder. But don't worry, doctors have amazing tools like ultrasounds, comprehensive blood work, and endometrial biopsies to diagnose the specific root cause and, crucially, to rule out the really serious stuff like endometrial cancer.
And finally, Chapter 6, Variation is Human Biology. We have covered a ton of ground today, from the brain all the way down to the microscopic follicles in the ovaries. So let's synthesize all this clinical evidence and go back to our original premise. Here's the big takeaway from this whole explainer. Fluctuating cycle lengths are not a bug in your system. The 28-day cycle is literally just a mathematical median, not a biological mandate. Month-to-month variation, driven by the timing of the follicular phase, anywhere from 21 to 35 days, is an entirely normal, totally expected feature of a healthy, dynamic female ecosystem. Your body is adapting, reacting, and functioning exactly as it was brilliantly designed to do.
Which honestly leaves us with this wild, perspective-shifting thought.
If the textbook 28-day cycle is really just a statistical average covering up a beautifully complex and highly individualized reality, what other strict rules about human biology might just be averages waiting to be explored? Never stop questioning the textbooks, guys. Thanks so much for hanging out with me for this explainer, and keep exploring.